All right. Well, thank you, Debelina, for the introduction, all the nice information. And for everyone else, it's a pleasure for me to be able to spend the next, say, 50 minutes to share with you some of the research activities that we have in this area. And I'm going to talk about an area which is really the major focus of my lab, which is on the circularity aspects of polymers. And specifically, I'm going to focus on polyolefins, which of course are very important for our region in the Houston area, and some approaches that we're looking at for how to address their end of life that might be an alternative to conventional recycling practices. But first, a few just introductory ideas about circularity and polymers. And before I do that, I just always like to start off a discussion of sustainability and polymers and just remind everyone of how important polymers and plastics really are for our daily life. We're very much pro-plastic, but we would not have clean water, we would not have light weighting of vehicles, we would not have fresh food transported around the entire country if we didn't have plastics. And so it's hard to imagine our quality of life without them. However, more recently, there's been a lot of interest in how can we maintain our access to these materials, but do this in a more sustainable way and reduce the environmental footprint of these what are really amazing materials. And that's really where my lab has focused probably at least 80% of our effort since I've become a professor at the University of Houston. And so when we think about the life cycle of polymers, there's lots of ways that as polymer scientists, we can contribute to reducing the environmental footprint or making them more sustainable. We can think about the origin of the materials as one aspect. For example, bio-based resources versus petrochemical resources, how much what the chemical and energy uses are, and the production and fabrication of the materials and also products made from them. And of course, it's not always obvious that one route is better than the other. For example, use of a bioresource could be good, but it could also incur more energy and chemical costs in the entire process. So important to look at all of these aspects. In addition, we can think about the material lifetime. Is it possible to extend that lifetime to have more multifunctional properties to make products more durable so they become waste at a delayed time point? And all of that could divert materials from the landfill. And then finally, at the end of the material lifetime, what are we going to do with these products? Can we use conventional recycling? Do we have to develop new processes? And how do we keep the value of those materials in our economy rather than just allow them to become waste in a landfill? I'd also like to point out that this is not a new topic. In fact, we can go back to the 1940s when Henry Ford was a big proponent of plants as substrates for materials. So this is a bumper made out of soybeans. We can think about the use of natural rubber, which goes back centuries. And this green chemistry pocket guide is probably at least 20 years old, but the ideas have not changed in terms of atom economy, minimizing waste, using benign chemicals, and that sort of thing, reducing emissions and pollution. And so we can apply all of these ideas to polymers as well. I like to highlight why I think we're at the University of Houston really ideally suited to be studying problems that relate to plastic circularity. And that's primarily because of our location in the heart of where petrochemicals and plastics are produced. And so we feel that's actually a real advantage to be in a location with such a high concentration of plastic manufacturing. Also, there is a lot of plastic waste in our region, and it does impact the Galveston Bay, the ship channel, and also there can be some vulnerable communities who are in these areas who are more impacted than others by the presence of this waste. So not only can we partner with, say, the producers of these materials and think about ways to address their end of life, but also we can have an impact on the local communities. And that's one of the reasons that our Energy Transition Institute is is including circularity as one of the three pillars in its emphasis, and also another motivation for starting up the consortium that Debelina mentioned at the beginning, at the introduction to this talk. Now, to my research group, as I mentioned, we've been studying these topics for quite some time, and we started more firmly focused in the areas of bio-based polymers, which I won't be focusing on in my talk today, but I'll just mention this is an area we're still actively researching in. And we're really agnostic to what types of materials and also even what resources are used. So we've made thermoplastics, additives for plastics, thermosets, elastomers, thermoplastic elastomers, and then from a wide range of sources, whether they're vegetable oils or lignin resources, cellulose, plant sugars, and other products that essentially are either a waste stream or something that can be regenerated on a more frequent basis than we need to use it. In addition, our group has worked on this idea of extending material lifetime, particularly in the area of thermosets, which tend to be quite brittle, but are also used in applications where they can have quite a long lifetime. And so if that lifetime can be extended even further by making them tougher, that will just defer the point at which they become waste. And a great example of that is wind turbine blades, where we're looking at some strategies for toughening thermosets that can be used in blades, but also how to address their end of life. And there's certainly a lot of landfills now that are starting to fill up with these blades that are coming to the end of their service life. And finally, we come to the end of life of polymers, and that's really where I'm going to focus today. But our group has done a lot of work on degradable polymers, which I won't focus as much today, but also in the last 5 years, focus more on recycling, which is the topic I'll tell you about, and specifically for polyolefins, which are a very important class of polymers. So just a few statistics on recycling. I will admit these numbers are getting to be a little dated, although in many cases they have not changed substantially, but we could just compare what's happening in the United States to other regions around the world. And you can see in the US, we're recycling less than 10% of the plastics. The EPA has stopped reporting these numbers a few years ago, but some studies have shown that might even be less than that, even as little as 5% within the US. You can see in other regions like in Asia and Europe, there's a much higher incineration rate with what's not recycled, but whereas we rely more on landfilling, and also we're recycling fewer plastics than globally. But around the world, it's about a 16% recycling rate. There's also this idea of mismanaged plastics, which is the plastics that end up in places we don't want them to be, such as in oceans. Previously, it was thought that our contribution was quite low to that, but more recent studies have shown that actually plastic from the US is going in places that we don't intend it to and around the world. So that also is becoming really a global problem. And this is just a recent study that talks about that, where they tracked essentially all of the plastic being produced and looked at where it ended up and what amount was mismanaged. And in the end, the real take-home message here is that our plastics in the US are ending up in coastal environments at a total amount that's actually among the highest amounts worldwide. So just to goes to show this is a global problem and we'll need global solutions. There's a lot of reasons why plastic recycling is as low as it is. Certainly, there are issues with collection and things that relate to societal factors that could be perhaps addressed through policy and regulatory interventions. But focusing a little bit more on the technology, one limitation is the fact that right now we're sorting all the plastics into different streams because they're essentially incompatible and don't want to mix. And in order to have a higher quality resin coming out of the process, we need to remove as many contaminants as possible. That also includes things like additives, which are now being combined in a very non-ideal ways in the plastic streams. And this can all lead to a general downgrading of properties when you compare the recycled resin to the pristine resin. Also, of course, there are classes of polymers, like I mentioned, the thermosets earlier, that cannot go through a traditional recycling process. And for those, we need to think about different methods than mechanical recycling, which has been the dominant process so far. But now specifically to talk about polyolefins. Polyolefins, where I'm really focusing on various types of polyethylenes as well as polypropylene. They're some of the most important plastics produced, around 60% of total production worldwide. And also, outside of high density polyethylene, which has one of the higher recycling rates, yet still only at 9%, once you get into the more branch structures of the low density polyethylene and also polypropylene, the recycling rates are quite low. So we saw this as these classes of materials as where we can have the biggest impact because we're producing a lot of them, and also we're not recycling very much, a very high proportion of what's being produced. So if we think about the approaches for recycling and why there might be challenges for polyolefins specifically, we can first think about a mechanical recycling process. In mechanical recycling, essentially the material goes into the recycling facility. It comes in with everything and has to be sorted and separated, cleaned. But then ultimately the stream will undergo melt processing, where the polymer is heated up above its thermal transition, whether that's a melting point or glass transition. When it's in the melt state, it can flow, it can be reprocessed into something new, it can be repelletized, and that resin can be used to make a new product. So that's the traditional process. When it comes to polyolefins, however, their chemical structures can be very similar. For example, if you think about polyethylenes with just similar, the differences in their branching content, it can be more difficult to start having a very pure, very uniform stream when their structures are so similar. When thinking about the traditional unit operations that are applied in a recycling facility for sortation. Also, even though these different structures may be difficult to separate, it actually doesn't mean that they're necessarily compatible with one another. Even different types of polyethylene that only vary with the branching can phase separate. And so if they're not compatible, then when you try to recycle them together, you're going to end up with a resin that has a very, very poor performance. If we think about alternatives to mechanical recycling, we could think about chemical recycling. Chemical recycling is essentially breaking down the molecules to small, either oils or small molecules, or creating other chemicals. And in that case, we then want to reuse the products of that process. This can be applied to polyolefins, but it comes at a cost. There's a large investment right now in advanced recycling of polyolefins, including in the Houston area. But certainly the cost, the energy costs for breaking down these very stable carbon-carbon backbones of polyolefins is substantial. So that's something that needs to be addressed. Finally, we can think about upcycling. Upcycling could often follow from chemical recycling, but in that case, we're not trying to make small molecules. We're not necessarily trying to make monomer to then reform the same polymer, but instead we're converting that material through a chemical transformation, typically to something new that can access new applications that original material would have not been appropriate for. And in this talk, I'm going to tell you a bit more about this upcycling strategy, specifically where we are converting polyolefins to make thermoset materials, which opens up different applications for those materials. Before I do that, I just want to tell you a bit about our center we have at the University of Houston. This is funded by the Welch Foundation, and it involves 6 faculty members who you can see on this slide. Three of us, myself, Alam Gir Kareem, and Raman and Krishnamurti, we come from chemical engineering. And then we are partnering with 3 colleagues from chemistry, Brad Caro, Olaf Stagulis, and Maurice Burkhart. And essentially, we're using some of the novel chemistries that our colleagues are developing to develop new routes for addressing polyolefin waste. And this center has 3 major thrusts. The first is addressing that issue that disparate plastics are coming together in a recycling facility and requiring sortation and separation. And what if we had additives that could reduce the need for those processes, or even with current processes, could improve the properties of the recycled resins, which still have some contaminants of various types. So that's one of the thrusts of our center. Another thrust is, can we make the backbones of polyolefins a little bit easier to break down? So if we apply a chemical recycling approach, the energy costs will be reduced, yet we still would want to retain the really amazing properties of polyolefins throughout this process. So we don't want to lose their performance that is needed for applications. And finally, our last thrust is on upcycling, so creating thermoset materials from polyolefins as a starting point. And that's where I'm going to focus today, specifically creating polyurethanes, which are a class of thermoset material. So first, I'll say that, as I mentioned, the stability of the carbon backbone of polyolefins can be a challenge, but there is good news on that front in that there are a lot of researchers already studying how to apply chemical transformations to polyolefins and functionalize them with various types of functional groups. This is a really nice review article that summarizes some of the recent work on this topic. So we can use these pathways that have already been established for bringing new functional groups to polyolefins, and this is all done on a post-polymerization modification, meaning this isn't something we're going to do as they're synthesized, but rather we can take the existing polyolefins and apply this type of transformation to bring something new to the material. So this is the general strategy we're going to use, where first the material is functionalized and then we convert it to our targeted material, which in our case is the thermoset polyurethane. But one theme through the work I want to tell you is that we are trying as much as possible to use industry relevant methods for all of our chemistry. So we want to be able to, for example, use melt extrusion to functionalize a polymer rather than solvent-based processes, with the idea that this would be more practical if applied to plastic waste and also could feed into existing equipment that would be available for polymer processing and industry. I did want to point out this idea of functionalization followed by upcycling is not actually new. In fact, we have just kind of a random set of papers here, but one going back as far as the 1970s, which show examples of bringing new functional groups to an existing polyolefin and then using that to create a material with new performance characteristics that allowed that polymer to be used in a new application. And then of course, the literature is just filled with this concept in lots of different iterations. So this is an active area of research that we can contribute to. Okay, so why polyurethanes? We were interested in polyurethanes because of their versatility and also because they tend to be applied in long-lasting applications. So the idea here is if we have polyolefin waste, right now in the United States, especially, we're not doing a very good job even of recycling this material just one time. But even if we did, if we make something that's only going to have a short lifetime as a product, eventually it's just going to become waste again in a short period. So if we can divert the waste plastic to longer lifetime applications where the product can be used for a matter of years or even decades, then that will keep the material out of the landfills. And so that's the general idea. And so polyurethanes have those characteristics. They can be used in furniture, they can be used in insulation, coatings. A lot of times they're foamed, and these are generally not discarded very quickly. They're not in products that are discarded quickly. There are two classes of polyurethanes. There are linear polymers and there are cross-linked polymers. The linear polymers can be melt processed very easily. The cross-linked generally cannot, although I'll tell you about a way to get around that in this talk. But the cross-linked materials generally have longer lifespans and are used in more durable goods. So that is the class of thermoset polyurethanes that we wanted to target. But we can vary the ratio of hard and soft segments. We can vary the nature of the hard and soft segments, and it gives a lot of tunability to the overall properties of the polyurethane. We were inspired by this article by Jiang, which was published in 2020, and this actually got us started down this line of research. What they did was they made N-functionalized polypropylene, where there are exactly two hydroxyl groups per chain. The hydroxyl groups can only be at the end. And then they react it with a traditional diisocyanate curing agent to form a polyurethane. So now they have a linear polyurethane. So this is the thermoplastic class that I mentioned on the previous slide, not the thermoset. And they actually had a co-monomer so they could bring in some softer segments and tune the properties in that way. So this was a very nice proof of concept that we can make a polyurethane from a olefin like polypropylene. But there are a few limitations. One, in that their hydroxyl groups are only at the chain ends. So they're only going to be able to make the thermoplastic class of linear polymers. Also, they use solvent-based processing, and we wanted to avoid this and bring everything into melt extrusion processes while also targeting the thermoset class. So that's our overall motivation. Can we convert polyolefin waste, like polypropylene waste, to a thermoset polyurethane to bring new value and expand the applications of that material? And we're going, even though we could make both linear and thermoset polymers, we will target the thermoset class, which means we need more than 2 functional groups, more than 2 hydroxyl groups added per chain for our polyolefin. And here are some reasons we might want to do this. So we may actually access properties which could be unique even in the polyurethane class, as polyolefins are not normally a starting point, but they have a lot of very nice attributes, such as their strength to weight ratio, their stability, their strength, their toughness, and so on. From a research standpoint, this project is very rich in questions that we can ask, and that's because polyolefins crystallize. They're semi-crystalline polymers, and so we're going to bring that semi-crystalline polymer into a 3-dimensional network when it's cross-linked and is formed into the thermoset polyurethane. And so that interplay between the formation of the network, but also the ability of the material to crystallize, we expect will be very important in governing the material properties. In addition, this is a very tunable system. We can vary the extent of crystallinity in the polyolefin. If indeed we can retain crystallinity when we form this network, we could, if we have polypropylene as a starting point, we could vary the tecticity. If we have polyethylene, we could vary the level of branching. We can also think about the molecular weight of the starting polyolefin and the degree of functionalization, both of which will impact the cross-link density of the cross-linked polyurethane that we form. So from a molecular design, there are a lot of aspects that we can look at. Okay, so what we relied on a functionalization route for polypropylene, which is actually very well established in industry, and that is the addition of maleic anhydride functional groups. In the presence of a peroxide, this can be done under melt extrusion. So it's a well-established process. We can vary the level of maleic anhydride grafting as well. And because polypropylene often goes chain scission, this process usually should reduce the molecular weight of the polypropylene. That's not a showstopper for us because we are going to take this functionalized polypropylene and then incorporate it into a cross-linked polymer through the formation of urethane bonds. So here's the chemistry we'll do. We start with this industrially available maleic anhydride grafted polypropylene. We're going to react it with ethanolamine. Now this can be done either in solvent or under melt conditions. So it can be done in a melt extruder. And we're going to form what we're calling hydroxylated polypropylene, or you'll also see this referred to as PPOH in these slides. Then we're going to take that PPOH, we react with a diisocyanate curing agent. Again, this can be in the presence of solvent or without solvent, and we form the polyurethane network. You're just seeing one strand of the network here, but this is really a 3-dimensional network. Again, the molecular weight that we start with and the level of functionalization will impact the cross-link density of this network. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about this. First, I will say, if I go back a slide here, the number of hydroxyl groups per chain is something we're interested in because we need at least 2 in order to form a cross-linked material and to make a thermoset class of polyurethane. But in our case, this is very easy to have at least 2 of these functional groups. And I'm going to show you some results, which were our initial proof of concept on this work, in which we had 12 of these functional groups per chain, so way above that threshold of 2. And what you can see here, we're looking at a mechanical analysis. This is a dynamic mechanical analysis. So we have the storage and the loss moduli as a function of temperature. At low temperature, the modulus is quite high. Um, Sorry, this is cut off, but there should be an 1,000 there. But this is quite high. And as we heat up, we go through a transition. This is actually at the very close to the melting point of the polypropylene, which we can measure through other methods. What you'll note is that at high temperatures, this does not continue to drop, but rather there's a plateau. That's telling us that we do indeed have a cross-linked polymer because it's acting like a soft solid at high temperatures rather than a viscoelastic liquid that you would expect if it were a linear polymer. And from this plateau modulus, which would be this E prime rubbery, we can calculate the cross-link density. So in this particular material, we had about 0.01 crosslinks, millimoles of crosslinks per centimeter cubed of material. But essentially, this is telling us we indeed formed a network, which was our goal. We want to make a thermoset polyurethane. The next point is that it's well known in traditional polyurethanes that these hard and soft segments can phase separate. So you can see here's a depiction of a traditional urethane where you have the soft segment, which is the hydroxylated molecule, the polyol that would be the starting point, and then the isocyanates are very rigid, so they're forming rigid segments in between the soft segments. And these hard segments will aggregate together and they phase separate. And you can see this through X-ray scattering. So we wanted to know in our material, will this happen? And so we looked at small angle X-ray scattering. We looked at a high temperature above the melting point of our polymer. And indeed, we do see a peak here, which we attribute to the aggregation of the crosslinks in our material. If we cool this down, that peak actually persists, but we see the formation of another peak, which is related to the crystallization of the polymer. Now we're below the melting point, so the polymer can crystallize. By the way, you'll see a lot of plots in this talk. The purple is generally the polyurethane. The green is our hydroxylated polymer that we cured to form the polyurethane. And the blue is the maleic anhydride grafted material that was the starting point for forming the hydroxylated material. But in all three, we see evidence of crystallization. And only in the polyurethane, we see this cross-link aggregation behavior, which again is characteristic of other polyurethanes. So we can consider our cross-links, which are the diisocyanate segments coming from the diisocyanate. They're coming together. They don't really want to be in the presence of the polypropylene. The polypropylene is kind of excluding those isocyanates as well. When it crystallizes, we envision there's mostly polypropylene in the crystalline areas, and in the amorphous regions are these aggregated crosslinks. Now, when we talk about crystallization, first of all, I should point out from the last slide, we could already see that our polypropylene is still crystallizing. Even though we converted it to this polyurethane, it's in this three-dimensional urethane network, it's still crystallizing. So the question is it crystallizing like polypropylene, or is there something different going on here? And we can look at the length scales of polymer crystallization. There are multiple length scales. We can look at the unit cell. Those unit cells pack into lamellae, which are sheets, and then those sheets are arranged in a sphere-like structure shown here. And we can examine all of these through a combination of X-ray scattering and also microscopy. And so from the wide angle X-ray scattering, these peaks are characteristic of the polypropylene unit cell, which is the alpha form. And basically, we just see no change in the unit cell, even though we've taken our polypropylene and turned it into a polyurethane network. From the small angle region, we can see that lamellar peak. This is going to give us these dimensions of the lamella. We have what's called the long period, the interlamellar spacing, and the lamellar thickness. All of those we can quantify. And again, if we compare our starting polymer, the maleic anhydride grafted, then the hydroxylated, and finally our polyurethane, we're not seeing any change in the structure of that lamella. The only difference we're really seeing is that there's more amorphous content in the polyurethane. So if we look up here at the degree of crystallinity, we see a drop for the polyurethane. And also, if we look at the interlamellar spacing, we see a bit of an increase, which makes sense if there's higher amount of amorphous content. If we zoom out and we want to look at the sphere lights, here are some nice images under cross-polarized microscopy. Of course, we could look at the crystallite diameter or the nuclide density as a function of the temperature we crystallize the material at. But what's noteworthy here is that all of our materials have very similar size of spherulites at a particular temperature, which again tells us that incorporating this polymer into this polyurethane structure is not changing how it crystallizes. Basically not on any length scale, whether we look at the unit cell, the lamellar features, or now the spherulites. It's acting like polypropylene would. And so essentially we think it's excluding those crosslinks in the amorphous regions. There's a little bit more amorphous content, but the polypropylene rich regions are crystallizing like they would if they were just neat polypropylene. Of course, this also has implications for things like the melting point, again, which is unchanged. We can look at the glass transition of the polypropylene segments. There's a little bit of an increase there when we bring this polymer into the network. And the same trend with the crystallinity that I talked about with the X-rays. There is a second glass transition in the polyurethane. We attribute that to the presence of that network, in addition to the glass transition that's attributed to the polypropylene segments alone. We can also study the kinetics of crystallization. So here we're using isothermal crystallization experiments where we basically heat the sample up into the melt, and then we cool down to a temperature below the melting point and hold it for a period of time until it crystallizes. And if we do this at a lot of different temperatures like shown here, you can basically, from the raw data, you can quantify the fraction of the sample that's crystallizing as a function of time. And from this, we can quantify what's called the half time, the time at which half the sample is crystallized, and also the induction time, which is the time at which nucleation starts, the nucleation process starts. And we can use an Arami process to model this data. But the take-home message here is from all of this data and its analysis, we can look at both the nucleation rate and also the crystal growth rate. And again, comparing across our three materials, even though we are bringing polypropylene into this network, it is undergoing crystallization kinetics just like it did for the neat polypropylene. Now back to something that's important for applications, which are the mechanical properties. So what are the mechanical properties of these polyurethanes like? And by the way, even though we're comparing across our three materials, maleic anhydride grafted polypropylene, hydroxylated polypropylene, and the polyurethane, we're actually even more interested in comparing our polyurethanes to other polyurethanes. But first, let's just look at the properties. The modulus is already quite high for this polypropylene, but when constraining it in the network, it increases further. Those constraints of the network structure also reduce the tensile strength of the polymer and make it quite brittle. So these polyurethanes are fairly brittle. If we look at polyester polyurethanes, that could perhaps be a good comparison because polyesters can also crystallize just like polyolefins. So if we look at the tensile strength range, we're right in the we're in a reasonable range. Modulus, we're quite high, and we're low on Lange-Champ break. So this is making a high modulus polyurethane, which is fairly brittle based on this initial proof of concept. However, I will note that we have not spent any time optimizing this system. I told you all of the molecular parameters we can tune, and there's really a lot left that we can do in order to achieve a variety of properties in this type of material. And so we're really just scratching the surface on that process with these initial experiments. One thing I've glossed over, which maybe was a puzzle earlier when I was talking about how these materials were made, when we want to fabricate the polyurethanes without solvent, we have a problem because if we are going to mix the polyurethane with the diisocyanate to do the curing, we're going to find that it's going to cure relatively quickly. And if we do that within an extruder, we're going to cure the sample within the extruder. So the question is, how do we prevent that process so we don't have to use solvent to kind of enable the mixing of the diisocyanate and the hydroxylated polypropylene before we form the urethane bonds? And one way to do that is a blocked isocyanate, where the sample is blocked, meaning you add a functional group so it can't react with the hydroxyl groups on the polypropylene. Then we could mix at a certain temperature, and then later we heat to a higher temperature in which it unblocks, and then we can cure. We did actually implement that. It works, but it's a little tricky to manage the blocking and unblocking temperatures and mixing and getting all of that to work out just right, considering these materials all have to be processed at a temperature above the melting point of polypropylene, which is quite high. Something we're processing these typically at around 180 degrees Celsius. So the approach we found that actually worked even better and that enabled this entire study is to rely on the literature on urethane exchange catalysts for polyurethanes. And this is an example. This tin catalyst, dibutyl tin dilaurate, is one that's very commonly studied. And essentially, these urethane bonds basically swap in the presence of this catalyst. So if the chains can swap bonds, that means you essentially can break the crosslinks and reform them. And this polymer, if we heat it up with the presence of this catalyst, we can process it at high temperatures, just like a plastic. So even though it's a thermoplastic, which traditionally you cannot heat up and remold and process, if you have this exchange catalyst, you can actually do all of that. You can use melt extruders. You can process it any way you would normally process a plastic. And so that's what we did. And I'll note, we actually looked at rheology to see that exchange process. Here you were looking at the storage modulus. And if our polymer was a linear polymer, this slope would be 1, a linear viscoelastic material like the maleic anhydride functionalized polymer we started with. When we make the polyurethanes, you can see this slope increases. So at the lower catalyst loading, it's not flowing exactly like a polymer melt would if it were a linear polymer. But as we add more and more catalysts, it reaches that limit. Our study was actually done with the lower level. Everything I showed you was this 0.6%. At that low level of catalyst, this material under these linear rheology conditions that we did these experiments doesn't flow exactly like a linear polymer, but under the higher strain of a melt compression molding, for example, or under the forces and strains in a extruder, the material will flow like a viscoelastic or linear polymer. And so, but you see this transition from a solid-like to a liquid-like material just by adding more of that catalyst. I'll note that this catalyst, people are trying to move away from this because of some toxicity issues. And that's another area of green chemistry. We're making alternatives for this exchange catalyst, not just for this project, but people are using this type of urethane exchange for the recycling of polyurethanes. So the existing polyurethanes that are being produced, but through the addition of this catalyst now can be put through a traditional mechanical recycling process. And finally, the whole point of adding this catalyst was not only to make the materials such that we can easily melt extrude them through the way that we formed the urethanes, but also after the end of life, they could be reprocessed. And we just did a little test of this by looking at how many times can we recompression mold our sample. So we just chopped up the test bars into pieces, compressed them together in a compression molding equipment, and we tested the tensile data again, and we basically didn't see significant changes in their properties upon reprocessing over and over. Okay, I don't have too much time, so I'll just take a couple minutes to tell you about this last aspect. This is changing gears just a little bit, but it's related, and that we're looking at lots of different ways to functionalize polyolefin. So I just told you about one project among many that we're working on in terms of polyolefin transformations and upcycling, and we're looking for different ways to bring in functional groups. And so this is another way, which is very relevant to the advanced recycling work that's going on in the Houston area, which is through pyrolysis. Except in our case, we're very interested in retaining the polymeric nature of the material after pyrolysis. So instead of forming oils or waxes, or even ultimately smaller molecules, we want to use pyrolysis to functionalize the polymer without losing that solid polymer nature of the material. And so in order to do that, what we do is we actually reduce the temperature of that pyrolysis compared to a traditional method. This also has the added advantage that this will reduce the energy requirements of this process as well. Okay, so I'll just show you a little bit on this. Traditional polyolefin pyrolysis would be, maybe temperatures of around 400 or around 400, say. If we're in the 300 range, what we find, here's 365. There, we're forming still a lot of liquid and gas. The solid content is maybe only 50%. If we go down lower, say 300 degrees, now we have more than 90% of what's produced is still a polymer. It's a solid, and very little liquid. That's almost negligible, and maybe 5% of this product distribution are gases. Another way to look at this is, so one thing I should point out, I think I forgot to mention this, not only in this pyrolysis process, what's happening is the chain is cleaving. And when it cleaves, what you end up with are these terminal vinylidene groups that I'm showing here. There should be one on each end of each chain. So we wanted to track the presence of those. And what we found is that the more of those terminal functional groups that we form, the more gas we're producing. Essentially, that gas is coming off from the process of chain scission. And that's the only reason we're getting this gaseous, a little bit of that gaseous product. Here are the reactions that are happening under this process. There's a scission process that's breaking the chains, forming radicals. There are intermolecular hydrogen abstractions. You end up with both propyl ends as well as those TBD end groups that we want. And then ultimately, through more transfers, we get more TBD end groups. And ultimately, our samples have what you'll see on this next slide. We end up with around 2 of those TBD end groups per chain, regardless of the temperature that we're using and the reaction time that we're allowing it to undergo the pyrolysis process. And the TBD end group formation is related to the molecular weight. Essentially, if we go from right to left on this plot, the more scissions we undergo, the more we break down the chain, the more TBD end groups that we're forming, as one would expect. So the novelty of this was that we are able to form N-functionalized polymers with these TBD end groups. The terminal vinylidene groups are very convenient. They're double bonds. You can convert them to other things. And so now we can use these for other upcycling applications of polyolefins in a similar way that we use the maleic anhydride route in order to form the thermoset polyurethanes. Okay, I think I've come to the end of my talk. And so just to conclude, we are trying to focus as much as possible on melt extrusion-based functionalization strategies for bringing new chemical features to polyurethanes like polypropylene. And here we use maleic anhydride functionalized polypropylene as a starting point to form a polyurethane. These were thermoset polyurethanes, which is an important distinction because it opens up a lot of the durable good applications. And we are confirmed that we had a cross-link network because above the melting point, the storage modulus plateaued. In addition, this polymer retained its semi-crystalline nature. So polypropylene essentially crystallized just like polypropylene does, but even though this material, the polypropylene, is constrained in this urethane network. And so we think that the amorphous regions will contain these urethane crosslinks, which are aggregating, and also the parts of the material, which are the crystals, are composed of polypropylene, which is sort of separate from the crosslinks, and that's enabling the polypropylene to crystallize like neat polypropylene. Whether we look at the unit cell, the lamellar features, the spherulites, or even the crystallization kinetics. Finally, we looked at one alternative strategy for functionalization, which was using pyrolysis, but a lower temperature process, which retains more than 90% of the material as a solid with N-functionalization that can be useful for further transformations. I'd like to thank the people who contributed to this, particularly the students. Renard is the PhD student who recently graduated and is now at Dow Chemical, and he did the majority of this work, but also with help from other students, Safat, Giannis, Amy. Amy was the person behind the pyrolysis work that I mentioned at the end, and Josiah and Kira, who also contributed. My collaborator, Ramanan Krishnamurti, who's a professor here at University of Houston and has been co-advising many of these group members with me, and other faculty at U of H who've been very generous with access to their instrumentation and core facilities. And with also our funding through National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and also the Welch Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, and is funding this larger effort on polyolefin transformations. So with that, hopefully I left a few minutes for questions, and I would be more than happy to answer them.